Hi everyone, welcome back to The Rock and happy June. I can't believe that it's June. It feels like just yesterday was March. The time is just flying so fast. So today we are learning about Jesus' disciples, and in preparing this lesson I learned so many new things that I had never known before, and so I'm really excited to tell you about them today. So, have you ever heard Jesus referred to as a rabbi? In the New Testament, in the Gospels, we read that Jesus was a rabbi, and a rabbi it just means master or teacher. And so, back in the Bible times, some of the Jewish people would decide to become rabbis, just like now, sometimes people decide to become teachers, and they studied and taught the scriptures. So if they were teachers, they of course needed students, just like your students and you have teachers, but instead of the students being assigned to a specific class like you are in school, the students actually went and found a rabbi that they wanted to study under. And then the rabbi didn't just take all the students or any students. He picked a few of the really, really good students and then kind of sent the rest home. And so he picked those students and they would become his disciples and they would follow him around everywhere. Doesn't that sound kind of familiar? Like we know someone else who did that as well. So here's where it gets super cool. We know that Jesus was a rabbi. I was talking about that earlier, but he did things very differently than the other rabbis, and that's one thing that I really love about Jesus, is that he just does things completely different than everybody else, because sometimes we think, oh, we have to do things the way they're doing it and we copy everybody else instead of just being ourselves and being unique. And so Jesus did things differently. Instead of waiting for students to come to him, he went out and picked his disciples. And as I'm sure you know, he picked 12 disciples who would follow him around as he did all of his ministry. And he didn't pick, like the rabbis picked the really impressive students. Jesus didn't do that. He didn't pick like super famous or like geniuses or like royalty, like princes and princesses. He didn't pick people like that. He just picked ordinary, average people just like you and me. He picked fishermen, he picked tax collectors, sinners who just lived ordinary lives. And so we're gonna watch the video now and learn more about these 12 men who Jesus picked as his disciples, and see if you can try to remember all 12 of the disciples' names, because I always have a hard time remembering it, and we'll go over that after.
Jesus' ministry had begun. He traveled around preaching about God and telling people to turn away from their sins. People started talking about Jesus and the things he was teaching. They were interested in what Jesus had to say. Large crowds followed Jesus around and listened to him teach. One day, Jesus was walking along the Sea of Galilee. He saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew. Peter and Andrew were fishermen. Jesus called out to them, "Follow me, and I will teach you to fish for people." Right away, Peter and Andrew dropped their nets and followed Jesus. Later, he saw two more brothers. Their names were James and John. They were in a boat, fixing nets with their father, Zebedee. Jesus called out to them, and right away they got up, left their father and the boat, and followed Jesus. Jesus went on and saw a man named Matthew, who was also called Levi. Matthew was sitting at the tax office. Matthew was a tax collector. Many people didn't like tax collectors because tax collectors were unfair. Jesus called out to him, "Follow me." So Matthew got up, left everything behind, and followed Jesus. Matthew had a big feast for Jesus at his house. Many tax collectors and sinners came to eat with Jesus and his disciples. The religious leaders saw this, and they didn't think Jesus should be friends with people who did wrong things. They complained to the disciples, "Why does your teacher eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus heard the religious leaders and said, "People who are healthy don't need a doctor, but people who are sick do. I did not come to invite good people. I came to invite sinners to turn back to God. Later, Jesus gathered his followers together and chose 12 of them to be his disciples. Jesus' apostles would work closely with Jesus and would go out to tell others about him. These are the men Jesus chose: Simon, who was called Peter, Simon's brother Andrew, James and John, who were called the sons of thunder, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James and the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot. Jesus came to earth to show what God is like and to save people from their sins. This is great news. Jesus told his disciples to tell others about him, and we are Jesus' disciples when we trust in him. Everyone in the world needs to hear the good news about Jesus.
Okay, can you remember all 12 of the disciples' names? Let's see if I can remember. Okay, so there were the brothers, Peter and Andrew, and then there were the other brothers, James and John, and then there was another guy named James. There were two James, and then there was Philip and Bartholomew. Bartholomew is always one of the ones I forget because he has a weird name. And then there was Matthew the tax collector, and then there was Thaddeus, that's another strange name. And then there was Thomas, who we learned later doubted Jesus, so he's called Doubting Thomas. Okay, that's 10. And then there was Simon and Judas Iscariot. There, I remembered all 12 of them. I hope you remembered them too. Maybe this week we can work on trying to remember all of those. For me, it helps to remember where they were in the video. I just close my eyes and picture it as they were talking about the different guys. Okay, so I think that this is just one of the coolest stories in the whole Bible. Can you imagine one day your mom and dad come to you and they say, so this random dude came up to us and he wants us to come and follow him. So we're going to quit our jobs and we're going to sell our house and we're just going to go follow this guy around as he tells people more about God. I feel like if my parents came to me and said that, I'd be like, okay, are you okay? Like, are you having an issue? Like, what is going on right now? Because that just sounds insane to just go follow some random dude you've never met before and just follow him around while he does his thing. But that's exactly what the disciples did with Jesus. They didn't know Jesus beforehand. It's not like they had been good friends or buddies for a long time. They had never met him before, and he just comes up to them and says, hey, leave everything behind, come follow me. And guess what? All 12 of them were like, okay. And they just left everything. They all had jobs, they had families, they had lives, and they just completely left them to follow Jesus. And the thing is, we should actually do the same thing. We should love Jesus more than we love our family, our friends, our jobs, school, our life even. We should love Jesus more than our life because he is the most important thing in our lives. He should be the most important thing in our lives. And so we all have the same decision to make as the disciples, because Jesus is standing here saying, come and follow me. And we have the decision to say yes or no. You can't ignore. If you don't say anything, you're just saying no. It's one or the other, right? And so you don't have to be famous. You don't have to be royalty. You don't have to be a genius. You just need to commit to following him. He picks ordinary people like you and me and wants all of us to come and follow him. And you might need to leave some things behind. You might not, well, you guys don't have jobs yet, so you might not need to leave a job. You probably shouldn't quit school. I wouldn't recommend that. You might not need to pack up and leave your family, but God does call us to leave certain things behind. He wants us to leave our sin behind. There are certain things that we like to do that we really shouldn't, that he wants us to leave behind. And as you get older, he might call you to different things and to leave different things behind to come and follow him. But you know what? It's worth it, because Jesus is always worth it. He is always more important than anything else in our lives. So there's a question today for the Question from Kids video from a lovely girl named Anna. It wasn't me, I promise. It was a different person. And she has a good question that relates a lot to this. So let's check that out.
Hey there, I'm Pastor Brian, and it's time for Questions from Kids. Anna Lee from Clinton, Mississippi asks,
How do we know if we are going to like God's plan?
all right, Anna, you might not like my answer because my answer might not be what you would expect. You are probably sitting there thinking, all right, Pastor Brian's going to give us this great explanation about how we're always going to like God's plan and it'll be really warm and fuzzy. Well, that's not the answer I can give. The answer I need to give is we don't know if we're always going to like God's plan because God's plan sometimes includes for us to go through suffering and hard things. We know this is true because think about God's plan for Jesus, his own son. God's plan for Jesus was that Jesus would suffer and die for the sins of the world. And so if God would have his own son go through that plan of difficulty and hardship, why do we think God would spare us from hard things? We're not promised that. And so while there are some times where God's plan for us is very pleasant, and we, appreciate that, there are times that God's plan for us includes difficult things, and we're just not gonna like it. But here's the key. It's not about what we like, it's about what we trust, and it's about who we trust. You see, whatever God's plan is for us, we need to learn to trust that God is at work no matter what for his glory and our good. That God will be glorified through anything, and that we can find that it is for our good as well, even if we don't see it on this earth. Now, one day in heaven, I believe we're gonna look back and God will show us why we went through what we went through, and we're gonna say, oh, now it makes sense. But that may not happen on earth. And so the key for us, again, is not necessarily to want to like God's plan, but to want to trust his plan no matter what. That's what faith is all about. So I've got a question back for you. Is it easy or hard for you to trust God's plan for you, and why?
Oh man, that was a really good question. And like Pastor Brian said, the answer to it is kind of tough because the truth is we're not always going to like God's plan. And remember earlier I said that Jesus wants us to follow him, but that's not always going to be easy because he's going to ask us to leave things behind and to come and follow him anyway. And so sometimes following Jesus is tough, but in the end, it is always the best thing. I promise you that. So let me just give you an example. I said earlier that sometimes you have to leave things to follow Jesus, and that has happened to me in my life. It might not always be the same thing for everybody. Everyone has a different story to tell, and Jesus has a different plan for everyone's life. But for me personally, I had to leave my old home. I haven't always lived here in Newmarket. Some of you may remember when my family moved to Newmarket and we started going to Grace Church. But I had to leave the house that I grew up in my entire life, the church that I grew up in my entire life, the town that I grew up in my entire life, all my friends. And I knew that it was God's plan for my life, but I can tell you I was not happy about it. In fact, I absolutely hated it, and I was very mad at God for a long time because of it. And yet I knew that it was what he wanted me to do. And I knew that he had the perfect plan for my life. And so for me in that moment, to be a follower of Jesus and to follow him, I had to leave a lot of stuff behind. But here's the thing. If I hadn't have left my old town and all of those things, I would never have moved to Newmarket. I wouldn't know any of you guys. I wouldn't have this job at the church. I wouldn't have all of the friends and amazing people that I've met here in Newmarket. And so in the end, like I said, God's plan was the best for my life because he loves us and he cares about us. And so he knows what is best for us and we don't. And so I'm so happy that we moved to Newmarket. And you know what? Someday God might call me somewhere else and then I'm going to have to leave Newmarket and all of you and this job and all of my friends here. But I know that if that's what God called me to do, that would be his plan, and that to be a follower of him, I should go and do that and do what he calls me to. And you know what? Things don't always work out that well. Some people, God calls them to things and it's not wonderful and fantastic and they don't make tons of new friends. Sometimes it's really tough, but in the end, in the very, very end, God's plan is always the best, because if you're a Christian, you know that one day you're going to end up in heaven with Jesus for all of eternity. And so I read a book once, and the guy in it said that the best is yet to come. And that doesn't mean that the next thing that's going to happen to you is going to be fantastic, or even that your life here on earth is going to be fantastic. It means that as a Christian, the best is always yet to come, because the best is heaven, and heaven is perfect. And we know that if we have accepted Jesus into our heart, that is where we're going to end up one day. And that's why being a Christian is so amazing and fantastic. So I hope that you have made the decision to follow Jesus, and I hope that you continue to follow him even when he calls you to do some crazy things or to leave behind some things that you love. So thanks again for joining, and we'll see you next week.